In this story, I'm going to tell you how I found out my husband and his mother were quietly moving our money and how I stopped them before I lost our home. I kept a small notebook. I noticed a loan I never approved and a signed page I didn't recognize. But here's the twist: I didn't get revenge by yelling or drama. I built a calm, legal paper trail: texts, bank alerts, calendar invites, and used one meeting and one document to make his whole story collapse. Watch to the end to see the exact proof that changed everything and the quiet move that let me reclaim my house and my voice. My name is Evelyn Marlowe. I am 36 and I live in Portland, Oregon, where for a long time my days kept a steady, comforting rhythm built around one person, my husband, Jonah. We met in college during a rainy student play that smelled of stage paint and secondhand coats. I was a stagehand then, hooked on cues and light plots, and he was cast as an anxious poet with a line he repeated until it was a private joke between us. We moved in together when we graduated. The economy was kind to hopeful graduates then, and 8 years later we bought the bungalow with the crooked porch and the white picket fence that leaned like a tired hand. It was small, imperfect, and it felt like a promise we whispered to each other. This place would be our forever home. I trusted Jonah in ways I didn't always trust myself. He had been there for the things that stitch people together. He held my hand the night my mother could no longer remember my name and promised we would shoulder the appointments together. He sat across from me at our kitchen table every Sunday and helped me sort through budgets and bills while we drank bad coffee and scrolled through half-broken banking apps, and he planned with me, breathless and earnest, the life we would have. A rescue dog whose ears would get in the way of kisses, a year abroad if my scholarship ever came through, and finally, a small studio in our backyard where I could teach community classes in movement and make space for other women like me to find their voices. Our trust felt concrete. He kept my keys on the hook by the door, handled our joint financial logins because numbers always made me dizzy, and was the one who called my family when I was exhausted. We had rituals: Friday night dinners with his mother, weekly calls to my sister, and late Saturday mornings spent mapping out the month on the wall calendar in the kitchen, in his loopy, confident handwriting. Jonah was magnetic and practical at once. He could coax a laugh out of anxious relatives and convince the bank to see our dreams as manageable. So when the first small crack appeared, it felt impossible. It was like finding hairline fractures in a window that had always been clear. At first, the cracks were almost tender, small disturbances I could explain away. I noticed Jonah staying later at the office on Wednesdays, changing our shared grocery lists, answering my questions with clipped, polite sentences. I told myself it was work stress. Then a bill arrived for a home improvement loan I had no memory of approving, and a delivery notification for a set of matching heirloom plates I had never ordered was left on our porch. Small things maybe, but enough. They made my stomach do something unfamiliar, like the inside of a room rearranging itself. I made the easiest choice: assume goodwill. I told myself Jonah had been trying to protect our future quietly, maybe planning a surprise for the studio. Still, I started keeping a little notebook in my bedside drawer where I wrote dates, odd conversations, and who was present. The habit felt like a calm insurance policy. When patterns repeated, I tried the gentlest solution we'd always reached for: conversation. I brought up the bank notice over our Sunday pancakes and asked Jonah if there had been a mistake. He smiled and reached for my hand like he had 100 times before and said he had handled the paperwork for the studio renovation, that it was all to keep me from being stressed. I wanted to believe him. But anomalies multiplied. A stack of emails about our mortgage under his keyboard referring to payments made through an unfamiliar portal, a calendar invite on his work account marked estate planning with his mother, June, who had a talent for turning small favors into a narrative about legacy. I tried to press calmly. Jonah deflected. He said June was old-fashioned about safeguarding family assets and he was trying to honor her wishes before she got flustered. When I suggested we call a financial advisor together, he had excuses: an old acquaintance already trusted. June began showing up more at the bungalow, bringing casseroles and soft admonitions that sounded harmless until they weren't. Notes about how heirlooms should stay with the line, stories about how certain decisions were best left to the men who understood their weight. Our Friday night dinners changed tone. Conversations that had been easy became lectures. The warmth that used to fill the room cooled into something measured and precise. My sister texted to ask if I had seen a message from Jonah about moving some savings into a trust labeled with June's maiden name, and when I asked Jonah in front of June, he laughed it off as a miscommunication. The first big fracture happened when I found a signed document on the coffee table, a one-page authorization moving a chunk of our joint savings into an account I'd never heard of. I remember the way the paper sat between the remote and the dog's chew toy, ordinary as a coaster. Jonah said he must have signed it in a haze of paperwork while sorting details for the renovation. He said he was trying to protect us and didn't mean any harm. We argued until the dog whimpered and left the room. I felt a small, cold thing settle in my chest, less a suspicion now and more a fact. After that, I took control in the only ways I trusted, with records, questions, and a strategy. I started monitoring bank notifications on my phone, saved every message where Jonah promised he would not move funds without my consent, and began archiving transaction alerts. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern: transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, signatories that didn't match the usual names. Each attempt to establish transparency met a wall of passive resistance. Jonah became distant, then defensive, accusing me of not trusting anyone, of being melodramatic. June, who had seemed like a steady presence until then, suggested I was too emotional to handle the complexities and that certain decisions required steadier hands. The house shifted, rituals that had bound us together became tools used to cut me out. I felt isolated and watched the anchors of my life, the calendar, the keys, the promises, being rearranged. Friends noticed my smaller laugh. My family asked careful, quiet questions that suggested they were afraid to pick sides. Jonah, exhausted and curt, suggested I stay with my sister for a few weeks while he finished studio work and sorted things out. His distance felt like a wedge. I refused to let that wedge become the end of my voice. I began a quieter, lawful campaign: copies, printouts, timelines. I made appointments with a financial counselor and a mediator who specialized in family property discussions under the pretense of talking about the studio budget so Jonah would agree to attend. I printed bank statements and compiled a line-by-line timeline in my little notebook. Those pages, once private and intimate, became evidence. The objects I gathered, transaction alerts, emails, texts where Jonah assured me nothing would change without my agreement, and the signed one-page authorization, felt less like evidence than like talismans against erasure. When we sat at the mediator's table with June present, it felt like standing on a stage where every private thing had been exposed to daylight. I spoke without anger, though my voice shook. I laid out receipts and asked simple questions. Who authorized the account transfers? Why had a trust been discussed without my consent? And why did a home improvement loan appear on a portal I had never used? Jonah's face shifted through confusion, irritation, practiced calm. He claimed a desire to protect our assets and blamed poor communication. June offered stories about tradition and how men in her family managed money. The mediator asked for proof of authorization. The documents I had assembled began to tilt the room. One detail I had seeded earlier, a memory inked into our shared life, became the key: the wall calendar. I pulled up a photograph of the original wall calendar from years before and compared it to a calendar invite Jonah had sent his mother using his usual shorthand. He had later used that shorthand to justify a transfer, calling it an emergency only he could see. The shorthand contradicted text messages where he promised transparency. When the probate attorney reviewed the materials, the immediate consequence followed. Our advisor placed temporary holds on transfers and demanded further records. That hold felt like the first real boundary with teeth. It protected the bungalow and bought time to untangle financial knots, but the emotional cost was fierce. Family dinners cooled to a polite distance. June stopped bringing casseroles and became small and tight-lipped in our presence. Jonah's apologies faded into silence. The house was half mine and half staged by someone trying to make me believe I had agreed to everything. The mediator recommended a full accounting. I prepared for a fight I was both terrified of and determined to see through, because I knew the only way back to a healthy relationship would be a truthful reset of power at home. The months that followed blurred into long checklists and scheduled conversations. We signed formal agreements. Joint financial actions required both signatures or a mediated exception, and the advisor reorganized portals so I had equal online access. I moved my weekly calendar back onto the wall with a bright red pen and insisted we go over it together every Sunday. June continued to visit, but now our gatherings were limited and often held at her assisted living facility. Jonah and I began couples counseling. The sessions forced conversations we'd been avoiding, about trust anchors and how he'd let loyalty to his mother eclipse our partnership. The revenge I enacted wasn't dramatic or malicious. It was procedural: paperwork, witnesses, rules. It reclaimed my agency in the most ordinary of ways, my signature back on the checks for our life. There was a small, quiet sweetness at the end of this upheaval. One family member I had assumed sided with June reached out and admitted they'd kept my notes, watching the pattern for months, waiting for me to be ready to act. They apologized and promised to be present at family meetings. Their allyship changed the dynamic. I stopped being the isolated spouse to be lectured and resumed being a participant in decisions. Jonah and I did not snap back into the old comfort. We set brighter boundaries, and when he tried to revert to old habits, I reminded him gently but firmly of the mediator's conditions and the protection they spelled out. My future, the studio, the dog, the quiet life of shared work was still possible. It would be built differently now, on written consent and shared calendars rather than assumptions. I learned to trust the rhythms again, but this time I made sure my name was on the ink. The revenge, if you could call it that, was not ruinous. It was reclamation, of voice, of choice, and of the home we had promised to keep together.